The engine shuddered a dry cough, then died. The entire space plunged into absolute silence. Claire Vaughn's knuckles were white from her tight grip on the steering wheel. She exhaled sharply her breath, fogging in the frigid air of the car. The light from her phone screen swept across the dark dashboard. The battery was at 8% and the signal bar was completely empty. No way. Not now. She muttered, her voice swallowed by the wind whistling through the mountain pass. Claire pulled up the collar of her gray blazer and pushed the door open. The wind whipped her hair into a frenzy, the cold seeping straight through her thin clothing. She teetered on her high heels over the gravel, trying in vain to open the trunk. Just as panic began to set in, a pair of dim yellow headlights appeared in the distance, accompanied by the heavy rumble of an old pickup truck. The truck stopped a few feet away. The door opened. A man got out. He was tall, dressed in grease-stained work coveralls. Holding a flashlight, he walked toward her. "Car trouble. Mind if I take a look?" His voice was deeper and raspier than she remembered, but that calm cadence made Claire freeze. She stood rooted to the spot, her hand clutching her purse so tightly it hurt. She squinted against the blinding flashlight beam. The man's face emerged from under the brim of a worn-out baseball cap. A few more wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, his skin weathered by sun and wind, but those eyes... Claire's heart skipped a beat, then began to pound in her chest. She wanted to say something, but her throat was tight. She could only manage a mechanical nod, stepping back to give him space. Ethan didn't notice her turmoil, or he didn't let on. He brushed past her, and the scent of motor oil and dry hay, a painfully familiar fragrance from years ago, filled her senses. He popped the hood. Claire stood right beside him, but she wasn't looking at the engine. She was looking at his hands. Rough, calloused fingers, stained with grease, were deftly working on a belt. His movements were as calm and steady as they had been years ago when he fixed her old car on the university campus. The memory flooded back so intensely that Claire had to press a hand to her chest, trying to steady her ragged breathing. "Broken serpentine belt," he said, without looking up. "Lucky for you, I have a spare." Claire's lips moved, her voice so shaky and faint it was almost a whisper. "Have you been doing this long?" "A while now. Got a small garage down in town." He replied curtly, the sound of a wrench clanking against metal. 10 minutes felt like a century to Claire. When her car's engine roared back to life, Ethan stood up, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. Claire stared at him, her eyes burning, searching for any flicker of recognition, but his gaze held only the polite distance of a stranger helping someone in need. She fumbled for her wallet, her trembling fingers pulling out a large bill, mostly to hide her inner chaos. "Please take this. You saved me." Ethan glanced at the money, then at her, and gently shook his head. He closed his toolbox. "It's just a $15 belt, no charge for helping someone out." "But your time..." Claire insisted, her voice trailing off. She wanted to keep him there just a moment longer. "Keep it..." He cut her off, his tone gentle but firm. "I have to get going. I need to pick up my daughter. She hates to be kept waiting." The words hit Claire like a bucket of ice water. A daughter. She froze, her hand dropping to her side. The fragile hope that had just sparked within her shattered. You have a daughter." Ethan smiled, a rare, gentle smile that softened the ruggedness of his face. "Yeah, a little girl." He gave her a nod, then turned and walked back to his truck. Claire stood alone in the cold wind, watching his broad back disappear. Tears welled up in her eyes, uncontrollable now. She looked down at the engine bay, where he had left a grimy business card, Riverside Garage, Ethan Parker. The name printed in bold black ink was both a cruel and tender confirmation. It was him. It was really him. Ethan's truck rumbled and vanished into the fog. Claire scrambled back into the driver's seat, slamming the door. She didn't drive on. She dropped her head onto the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking with silent, choked sobs. 15 years of running, 15 years of trying to forget. And now he was here, just a mountain pass away. Claire lifted her head hastily, wiping her tears. She looked in the rearview mirror, her expression shifting from anguish to unwavering resolve. She flicked on her left turn signal and cranked the wheel, turning the car around. The headlights swept across a sign for the Riverside exit, illuminating the road Ethan had just taken. She pressed the accelerator, plunging into the night, to chase the man she thought she had lost forever. 15 years to try to forget, but only a moment to remember it all. Claire's decision to turn back in the foggy night wasn't just about returning to a town. It was about bravely turning back to face her own heart. Dear friends, have you ever run into an old flame and felt time stand still, just like Claire? If this story touched a corner of your memory, please give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Your support is the fuel that helps us tell more healing stories every day. And leave a comment below if you're curious about their past. What could have possibly torn them apart? For now, let's let time flow backward, 15 years ago, to where it all began. The car sped through the night, but Claire's mind had already traveled back 15 years to a small garage behind the university. Back then, Ethan Parker was the poor student mechanic always in a pair of grease-stained coveralls, and she was the privileged Claire Vaughn, who always claimed her brakes were failing just to spend hours hanging around his workshop. Busted again, the 20-year-old Ethan would often laugh a bright smile that outshone the grease smudge on his cheek. I think you should either get a new car or a new mechanic. Trade you a coffee for the labor, she would reply, holding out a hot paper cup from the cafeteria. Those afternoons were strangely peaceful. Claire would sit on a high stool reading an economics textbook while Ethan worked under a car. The clinking of wrenches and the static of the radio broadcasting the weather report was the only music they needed. They shared cheap sandwiches from the convenience store and talked about far-fetched dreams. He wanted his own garage by the river. She wanted to escape her father's long shadow. But reality always has a way of knocking cold and polite. One rainy afternoon, her father's sleek black sedan pulled up sharply in front of the dilapidated workshop. He stepped inside his polished leather shoes, untouched by a speck of dust, a stark contrast to the oil-slicked floor. "Hello," he said, his tone even, but creating an invisible wall. "Thank you for fixing Claire's car. I'll have my manager send payment for your services." Ethan stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and nodded respectfully. No disdain was spoken, but the way her father's eyes swept over his grimy clothes said it all. You don't belong in her world. The turning point came the following week. Ethan's mother was rushed to the hospital back in his hometown. He left in a hurry during a stormy night, managing only to send a text saying he'd be back. But the message lost to a network jam never arrived. A few days later, a friend showed Claire a hastily taken photo. Ethan at a funeral in his hometown, holding a newborn baby, his expression a mixture of gentleness and grief. "I heard it's his wife and kid from back home." The friend commented casually. "He must have been hiding them from you." Claire stared at the photo, her hands trembling. She didn't ask questions. She didn't call. The pride of a young woman and her father's unspoken warning slammed the door to her heart shut. She quietly packed her things and accepted an internship in New York that very night. Before leaving, she left a neatly folded clean gray handkerchief, one Ethan often used to wipe his sweat, in a drawer in the workshop. It was her wordless goodbye. When Ethan returned to campus 2 weeks later, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked on the roadside, her dorm room was empty. The familiar coffee shop had a new owner. Her phone number was disconnected. He stood in the middle of the vast campus, realizing he had lost her without knowing why. All he found was the folded handkerchief in the drawer. He clutched it sitting silently in the darkness of the workshop, all night listening to the steady drumming of rain on the old tin roof. Time passed mercilessly. Claire became a queen of multi-million-dollar deals in New York, while Ethan returned to Riverside, becoming the reluctant single father to a baby girl named Lily, an orphan he had saved on a different rainy night. Two parallel lines that seemed destined never to cross until 3 days ago. In her 40th floor office in Manhattan, Claire received an email inviting her to speak at the Riverside Economic Summit. The name of the small town made her pause amidst a mountain of paperwork. She opened her desk drawer where she kept things she couldn't bear to throw away. In the very back, under a pile of documents, was a rusty bolt, a silly keepsake Ethan had given her the first time he'd single-handedly fixed an engine. She picked it up, the cold metal against her skin. For 15 years, she had it all: money, prestige, lavish parties. But she had never recaptured the peace of those afternoons, eating cheap sandwiches in a workshop that smelled of motor oil. "Book the ticket," she told her assistant, her eyes gazing out the window at the brilliant but lonely lights of New York. Back in the present, Claire pressed harder on the accelerator. The car flew past the town sign. The old memories didn't make her hesitate. They only fueled her burning desire for answers. She wasn't coming back for a conference. She was coming back to find the part of her life she had left behind. In the distance, the faint, warm lights of Riverside appeared in the valley, small and quiet, as if waiting. Claire stepped out of the car in front of the Riverside Community Conference Hall. The air here was different from New York. It was still mixed with the scent of roasted coffee and damp wood. The driver helped her with her briefcase while she stood still, adjusting the lapels of her blazer, her gaze drifting unconsciously across the street. A faded hand-painted wooden sign caught her eye, Riverside Garage. The roll-up door was wide open, revealing a dark interior, where a figure was faintly visible working. Claire's heart clenched. It was small old, but it exuded a sense of steadfastness just like its owner. A middle-aged woman walking by saw her staring and smiled warmly. "Looking for a mechanic, dear Ethan over there, is the best in the region. Poor man been a single father for all these years, and you never hear him complain." "A single father?" Claire repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The information settled in her heart, like both a comfort and a small scratch. She gave the woman a polite smile and quickly walked into the conference hall, trying to suppress the rising turmoil inside her. In the afternoon, as the sun slanted through the oak trees, Claire's luxury sedan ran into trouble on the way back to her hotel. A loud bang echoed, the car swerved and then listed heavily to one side. The rear tire had blown. As her driver was fumbling to call for roadside assistance, a familiar old pickup truck pulled up and stopped. Ethan got out. Still in his dark coveralls, a wrench in his hand, he looked as if he belonged to this very road. "Need a hand?" he asked, then stopped short when he saw Claire lower the rear window. For a second time seemed to stand still. Their eyes met no longer with the shock of the other night, but with a quiet, somber recognition. "It's me again," Claire said, trying to keep her voice as natural as possible. "It seems I'm always having car trouble when you're around." Ethan didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "The roads around here aren't kind to tires that thin." He waved the driver aside and got to work himself. Claire opened her door and stepped out, standing on the shoulder of the road. She watched him work. His back was soaked with sweat, his movements efficient and silent. She wanted to ask him so many things about the past years, about the wife who had left or passed away, about why he chose to stay in this sleepy town. But she chose silence. Just then, a clear voice called out from the opposite sidewalk. "Daddy, I got the apple pie." A little girl about 7 years old, with her hair in a lopsided ponytail, came running across the street. Ethan quickly stood up, catching her in his arms before she could run into his pile of tools. "Careful, Lily!" His voice was low, full of love. He brushed some dust off her shoulder, his eyes sparkling with a joy Claire had never seen in him 15 years ago. Claire stood frozen. Lily turned to look at her and politely bowed her head. "Hello, ma'am." Claire forced a smile, feeling like an intruder spying on someone else's happiness. "Hello, Lily. You're a very good girl." Ethan looked up at Claire, one hand still protectively on his daughter's shoulder. The image of father, a child, and the peace that enveloped them was so beautiful it made Claire's heart ache. She realized she was jealous, not of love, but of the simple, grounded life he had. I have to go," Claire said hurriedly, turning back towards the car as her driver signaled that he was ready. The car pulled away. Through the rearview mirror, she saw Ethan taking Lily's hand, walking back toward the garage, their two shadows stretching long on the sun-drenched pavement. Back in her hotel room, Claire didn't turn on the lights. She sat by the window, looking down at the town as it lit up for the evening. The light from the Riverside garage sign was still a faint glow in the distance. She opened her phone, her finger hovering over the Google Maps search bar. She typed in Riverside Garage. There were no reviews. Claire took a deep breath and tapped the 5-star icon. In the comment section, she typed a short line, deleted it, and finally just left an ellipsis. Best service. And then some. She hit post. The screen went dark, leaving her alone in the shadows, her heartbeat still refusing to settle. 3 days after their chance encounter on the road, Claire's car was once again parked in front of Riverside Garage. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted from the valley, and the air was damp and still. Claire sat in her car, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the steering wheel. She told herself she was just here to check the tire pressure before heading back to New York, a perfectly logical and safe reason. She got out, adjusting the lapels of her expensive cashmere coat, which looked completely out of place in the dusty setting. Through the grimy glass of the garage door, she saw Ethan squatting on the floor. He wasn't fixing a car, he was holding a small paintbrush. Beside him, Lily was giggling, her hands smeared with paint. "No, Daddy, you colored outside the lines." The little girl's voice came faintly through the glass. "I told you my hands are only used to holding hammers." Ethan's voice replied, full of warm resignation. Claire stood outside watching. She saw his smile, not the polite one for customers, but the full, genuine smile of a man happy with what he had. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The tinkling of a small bell made the father and daughter look up. "Miss Claire," Lily chirped, dropping her brush. She started to run over, but remembered her dirty hands and stopped, grinning widely instead. Ethan stood up hastily, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Car trouble again?" I heard a little rattling sound. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Claire lied, avoiding his direct gaze. "Let me take a look," Ethan said, either not suspecting or being tactful enough not to call her out. While he checked the car, Claire lingered near his cluttered workbench. A pink backpack hung next to boxes of oily spare parts. The contrast made her heart ache. She looked around, searching for any trace of a woman, a makeup compact, a woman's jacket, anything. But there was nothing. "Have you and your wife been living here long?" Claire asked, her tone deliberately casual, as she fiddled with the edge of the bench. Ethan's voice, slightly muffled, echoed from under the hood. "I've never been married. It's just been me and Lily." Claire's hand froze. She spun around to look at his back. "Never?" Ethan looked up, wiping a grease smudge from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at her, his gaze direct and calm. "That's right. Never." The answer was short, without explanation or drama. Claire stood rooted to the spot, a confusing mix of relief and emptiness washing over her. For 15 years, she had been jealous and heartbroken over a ghost that never existed. Leaving the garage with the confirmation that her car was perfectly fine, Claire didn't go straight back to the hotel. She stopped at Ruth's Corner, the oldest general store in town, to buy a bottle of water, but really to calm her racing heart. Mrs. Ruth, a white-haired woman with sharp eyes behind her reading glasses, recognized her immediately. "You're the lady who was asking about Mr. Parker the other day, aren't you?" Claire nodded, holding the water but not yet ready to pay. "Do you know him well?" Mrs. Ruth stopped stocking cereal boxes on the shelf and let out a soft sigh. "Everyone in this town respects that man. You see how happy little Lily is now, but when he brought her home, she was blue as a drowned kitten." "Brought her home," Claire frowned. 7 years ago, during the worst storm this region has ever seen. Mrs. Ruth recounted, pointing toward the door. "Some heartless soul left a basket right on this doorstep. The police were blocked by mudslides. Ethan was passing by on his way back from a delivery. Without a word, he just took off his own thick coat, wrapped up that baby held her to his chest, and ran all the way to the clinic. The next day he started the adoption process. He was only in his early 20s then, poor as a church mouse." Claire stood in stunned silence. The image of Ethan 15 years ago, holding a baby at a funeral, the image that had made her give up, shattered and reassembled itself in her mind. It wasn't proof of betrayal. It was proof of a heart so kind, it was almost foolish. She left the store, a powerful urge rising within her. She remembered the small handkerchief Lily had dropped when she ran out to greet her at the garage earlier. It was just an excuse, but she needed one. Claire followed the address on Google Maps, finding the small wooden house by the river's edge late in the afternoon. The house had an old tin roof, but the porch was overflowing with bougainvillea, and there was a swing made from a brightly painted tire. Lily was the one who opened the door. "Miss Claire, are you here to play?" "I'm returning this to you," Claire said, holding up the handkerchief. Ethan came out from the kitchen, holding a steaming teapot. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt, looking more comfortable and approachable than in his work clothes. "Come on in, the river wind is cold out here." The house was smaller than Claire had imagined. The living room had only a worn sofa and a bookshelf made of scrap wood. But it was warm. On a shelf she saw carefully dusted picture frames, Lily learning to walk Lily on her first day of school, and a black and white photo of Ethan's mother. There was no sign of any other woman. "Ginger tea," Ethan said, placing a ceramic mug in front of her. No espresso like in the city, I'm afraid. This is wonderful, Claire replied, cupping the mug in her hands for warmth. Lily ran over, holding out a scribbled drawing. Look, I finished it. The picture showed a house, a cat, Ethan holding a wrench and a long-haired figure standing beside him. This is you, Miss Claire, the little girl said, pointing to the figure and grinning. You're standing next to Daddy. Ethan looked at the drawing, then at Claire, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Claire smiled, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. Thank you, sweetie. I look very pretty. The sun set, painting the river gold. Lily went to sit on the porch steps, singing softly to the cat. Ethan and Claire stood leaning against the wooden railing watching her. You know, Claire began, her eyes still on the shimmering river. Mrs. Ruth told me about that rainy night. Ethan was quiet for a moment, swirling the dregs of his tea. She exaggerates. I just did what anyone would have done. Not everyone dares to do what anyone would have done when they have nothing. Ethan, she said, turning to him. Her gaze held no suspicion, only raw admiration. Thank you for keeping a little bit of decency in this world. Ethan turned to look at her. The river breeze blew a stray strand of her hair across her face. He gave a small, sad, but peaceful smile. I didn't keep anything. I just couldn't bear to let it disappear. It's like how I fix old cars. They deserve a second chance to run. Claire didn't reply. She understood he wasn't just talking about cars or about Lily. Perhaps he was talking about their own lives. By the time Claire drove away, it was dark. She stopped at the head of the bridge and looked in her rearview mirror. The small, lit-up wooden house by the river looked like a warm ember in the vast darkness. She took out her phone and opened her calendar app. Her finger hovered over the entry, Flight to New York, tomorrow. Paused for a second and then decisively hit cancel. She typed a new note, Riverside, extend 1 week. Claire smiled, dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, and drove slowly back toward the town where a man and a little girl were waiting for tomorrow. The next morning, fog rose from the river, blanketing the town and blurring everything into soft shapes. Claire parked in front of Ethan's wooden house, holding a warm paper bag that smelled faintly of baked goods and a brand new set of colored pencils. Lily was the first to hear the car. She ran to the door, her bare feet pattering on the cold wood floor, and shouted, Miss Claire is here. Ethan came out of the kitchen, a dish towel in his hand. He looked at the bags in her hands with a hint of embarrassment. I thought you had a meeting this morning. This time, I'm here for Lily, not for car business. Claire smiled, holding up the bag of bagels. I brought breakfast. I hope you two haven't eaten yet. Ethan scratched the back of his neck, a familiar, awkward gesture. All we have is drip coffee and cheap strawberry jam. Might not be to your taste. Claire unbuttoned her coat, hanging it on a hook by the door, as naturally as if she'd done it 100 times. In college, I lived on instant noodles for a month to save up for textbooks. Trust me, I'm not as picky as I look. She sat down at the tiny dining table by the window. Ethan watched her for a moment, his gaze softening. He poured her a full mug of coffee and set it on the table. Back then, you were trying to prove to your father you could survive without his money, weren't you? Claire looked up a little surprised, he remembered. She stirred her coffee slowly, her voice lowering. Yes, but then I realized not everyone has the luxury of choosing hardship just to prove a point. For many people, it's a necessity. Ethan didn't answer, just quietly spread jam on a bagel for Lily. In the small kitchen, the clinking of a knife against a plate and Lily's happy sighs over the warm bagel created a kind of domestic music Claire had craved for a long time. After breakfast, Claire's phone rang, shattering the peaceful atmosphere. She stepped out onto the porch to take the call. Her voice changed instantly, sharp, decisive, and full of authority. No, raise the bid to $7 million. But we maintain a 51% controlling stake. I don't care what they say, stick to plan A. Ethan, clearing the dishes in the kitchen, overheard snippets of the conversation. He glanced outside at her straight-back silhouette against the gray sky. When she hung up and came back inside, he was drying his hands on a kitchen towel. Sounds big, he said, his tone neutral, but with a hint of distance. You hold the world in your hands, don't you? Claire looked at him, then at Lily, who was busy coloring in the corner. And you hold Lily's whole world in yours. Ethan lowered his head, the faint smile on his lips fading. No more was said, but the invisible gap between her designer blazer and his faded t-shirt suddenly felt wider than ever. In the afternoon, Lily insisted on repainting the rickety wooden fence in the backyard. Claire rolled up her silk shirt sleeves and grabbed a brush to help. Ethan reluctantly agreed, but he kept a close eye on her, worried she'd ruin her expensive clothes. "Look, Daddy!" Lily swiped a bright blue streak onto a wooden plank, then accidentally flicked her brush, leaving a smear of paint on Ethan's arm. Claire laughed and instinctively grabbed a damp cloth. "Let me get that for you. It's hard to get off skin." She reached out to wipe the paint from his bicep, but Ethan flinched back slightly, avoiding her touch. "It's fine. I can get it. I'm used to taking care of things myself." Claire's hand froze in midair. She looked at the paint on his sun-tanned skin and calloused hands. His gentle rejection was a reminder he had his own pride, a territory she couldn't just walk into. Claire pulled her hand back and quietly returned to her work. Lily looked between the two adults and innocently remarked, "You two are like my friends at school. You're always so polite to each other." As evening fell, Claire left. Before she did, she secretly tucked a small envelope into Lily's drawing book. Inside was a $500 gift card. She simply thought Lily could use some new clothes for the coming winter. But the next morning, as Claire was reviewing documents in the conference lobby, Ethan appeared. He was wearing his cleanest clothes, but still looked out of place among the sharp suits. He walked straight to her table and placed the envelope on the glass top. "Ethan." Claire was surprised. "I know you meant well," he said in a low voice, trying not to draw attention. "But I don't want Lily growing up thinking she needs someone's pity to have clothes on her back." Claire was stunned. She stood up to face him. "I wasn't pitying anyone, Ethan. I just see you two working so hard and I wanted to help a little. That's reality, not a handout." Ethan looked directly into her eyes. His were not angry, but sad and resolute. "I know you're used to solving problems with a checkbook, but for me, easy has never been an option. We're fine with what we have." He gently pushed the envelope back toward her, gave a curt nod, and turned to leave. Claire watched his straight back disappear, a hot flush spreading across her face. For the first time in years, she felt small in front of a man who had nothing but his pride. That night, Claire went for a drive alone. She unconsciously ended up on the road along the river. The light was still on in Ethan's house. Through the uncurtained window, she saw him sitting on the sofa, reading a story to Lily. The little girl was curled up against him, giggling. The room was cramped, the furniture old, but it was filled with a warm golden light. Claire turned off the engine and rolled down the window, letting the cold wind hit her face. She whispered to herself, "A small house, but it has everything that all of my mansions lack." She sat there in the darkness for a long time, watching the picture of happiness she couldn't buy with money, before silently starting the car and heading back to her luxurious but cold hotel room. The October rain hammered on the garage's tin roof, creating a relentless drumming that isolated the three of them in their own little world of motor oil. Ethan was under an old Ford, struggling with a rusted bolt. The wrench was slippery with grease. Clang! The sharp sound of metal striking the car's frame echoed through the garage. Ethan let out a grunt, clutching his left hand. Dark red blood quickly seeped from the back of his hand, mixing with the black grease. Lily, who had been coloring, jumped up and dropped her crayon. "Daddy, blood! There's so much blood!" Ethan bit his lip, trying to hide his hand. "It's okay, Lily, Daddy's hand just slipped." But the little girl was already panicking, bursting into tears. At that moment, the workshop door swung open. Claire stepped in, shaking off a wet umbrella. She froze instantly at the scene, Ethan sitting on the floor, clutching his hand, and Lily sobbing. "What happened?" Claire tossed the umbrella aside and rushed over. "Daddy's hurt. There's so much blood." "Miss Claire," Lily wailed, pointing at his hand. Claire didn't ask another question. She knelt beside Ethan, her voice calm but firm. "Let me see your hand." "It's nothing, just a scratch." Ethan tried to pull away, but Claire grabbed his wrist and held it fast. "Stay still." She commanded her stern gaze, making him stop. She examined the wound. It was a gash about 2 inches long on the back of his hand, fairly deep, but luckily it hadn't hit a tendon. Blood was still steadily seeping out. Claire exhaled, her shoulders slumping with relief. "Thank God it's not too deep." A few more millimeters and I'd be driving you to the ER. As she cleaned the wound under cold running water, Claire noticed a faint old scar on his thumb. A memory flashed back. It was the scar he got when he pinched his finger while fixing her car all those years ago. Her heart tightened. "Lily, can you get me the roll of bandages from the desk drawer, please?" Claire said deliberately, sending the child away for a moment. When they were alone, Ethan hissed in pain as she applied antiseptic. "You're so stubborn," Claire chided gently, wrapping the wound with gauze. "Hurting this much and not making a sound?" "I'm used to it," he replied, his eyes fixed on her movements. "You're much better at this than you used to be." Claire paused for a beat. She reached into the first aid kit for more gauze when her fingers brushed against something soft, tucked away in a small zip-top bag at the bottom. She pulled it out. It was a gray handkerchief embroidered with the initials CV Claire Vaughn, the one she had left in the university workshop 15 years ago as a goodbye. It was still here, clean and neatly folded, nestled among cotton balls and antiseptic wipes. Claire held the handkerchief, her hand trembling. She shot her gaze up to meet Ethan's. You still kept it." Ethan looked at the handkerchief, his gaze unwavering. His voice was low, blending with the sound of the rain. "When I came back to campus, it was the only thing I found in the drawer. I ran to the dorm to the coffee shop, but you were gone. I thought you had a family." Claire's voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "I saw that picture of you back home, holding a newborn at a funeral. They told me it was your child." Ethan was stunned. He straightened up, forgetting the pain. "That picture? That was my sister's funeral. She died in childbirth. That baby was my nephew. I went home to handle the arrangements and find someone to adopt him." The world seemed to stop. 15 years of silence, 15 years of heartache, all because of a wordless misunderstanding. Claire's hand went limp, the gray handkerchief falling softly onto his lap. So, there was no wife. Never? Ethan confirmed, his eyes pained and honest looking, deep into hers. "I waited, but you never came back." Claire covered her mouth, stifling a sob. She had run from the man who loved her all because of fear and youthful pride. She bent down and continued to bandage his hand, but this time her fingers touched his skin more gently, as if to make up for the wounds that couldn't be seen. Lily returned with the medical tape. Sensing the strange atmosphere, she asked innocently, "Miss Claire, are you hurting Daddy?" Claire quickly wiped her eyes and smiled at the little girl. "No, sweetie, I'm helping Daddy heal." Lily stood beside them, her eyes still teary, and asked with a sniffle, "So, does Daddy not have to practice eating with his right hand anymore?" The innocent question made Claire laugh out loud. "Not yet, kiddo, but it's always good to be prepared." Ethan looked at his daughter, then at Claire, who was carefully securing the last piece of tape. He let out a soft chuckle, the sound breaking the tension in the workshop. "Thank you, I owe you again." After his hand was bandaged, Ethan rested on a stool. Claire looked around the workshop. On his desk was a pile of unpaid bills and a box of cold leftovers from lunch. The mess wasn't from laziness. It was a sign of exhaustion. "Don't you ever rest, Ethan?" she asked, handing him a glass of warm water. Ethan took the glass and drank deeply. "When you're a single dad, rest is a luxury, Claire." Claire leaned against the workbench, watching him intently. "You refused my money yesterday, but look at you. You're running yourself into the ground." "It's called survival," he replied, his voice low. "I don't have the right to get sick." Lily, who was tidying up her crayons, suddenly looked up. "Daddy says survival, like a superhero in a comic book." Ethan and Claire looked at each other and laughed. A child's innocence always had a way of smoothing the sharp edges of reality. The rain outside grew heavier. Because of his injury, Ethan couldn't work anymore. The fatigue of countless days finally caught up to him, and he drifted off to sleep in an old armchair in the corner. Claire stayed to help clean up the scattered tools. Lily scampered around, helping her fold the oily rags. The little girl took Ethan's thick jacket and gently draped it over her sleeping father. "Miss Claire," Lily whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "Daddy always says, I'm okay, but I know he's not." Claire looked at Ethan's sleeping face. The worry lines on his forehead had relaxed, making him look younger and more vulnerable. "I think so too," she whispered back. "Don't tell him I said that, okay? I promise to keep it a secret," Lily said, putting a tiny finger to her lips. Claire stroked the girl's hair, her heart aching with affection. This child was wise beyond her years. She nodded. I promise. The next morning, a rare ray of sunlight streamed through the fogged-up glass door, waking Ethan. The ache in his arm reminded him of yesterday's accident. The garage was empty. Claire and Lily were gone. On his workbench next to a still-warm pot of coffee was a yellow sticky note attached to his toolbox. Sometimes it's okay to let people help you. Stop trying to be a superhero all the time. C. Beneath her neat handwriting was a crooked drawing by Lily, a lopsided heart with the words, "Me and Miss Claire did this together, Daddy." Ethan picked up the note, a small smile playing on his lips. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his worn leather wallet right next to the only photo he had of Lily and his mother. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to lean on someone else, even just a little. But the peace didn't last long. Around 10 o'clock, just as Claire returned to the workshop with a bag of donuts, a strange sound came from the main road. The purr of a powerful, smooth engine, entirely different from the noisy pickup trucks of the town. A sleek black sedan slowly pulled into the damp gravel lot and stopped right in front of the garage. The car door opened. A man got out. He wore a long wool overcoat. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed, and his entire demeanor radiated cold authority. Claire froze the bag of donuts, nearly slipping from her hand. Her face went rigid, the budding smile instantly vanishing. Ethan, who was wiping down a car, looked up at the stranger, then turned to Claire and asked quietly, "Who's that a client of yours?" Claire couldn't look at Ethan. She stared at the approaching man, her voice trembling. "My father." The black sedan's engine went silent, leaving a heavy quiet in the gravel lot. The car door opened decisively. Mr. Richard Vaughn stepped out. His polished leather shoes met the grease-stained ground, a jarring contrast. He stood there adjusting the lapels of his wool coat, his sharp eyes scanning the dilapidated Riverside garage sign, before settling on Ethan, the man with the bandaged hand and worn-out work clothes. Ethan stood up straight, neither flinching nor backing down. He set his coffee mug down and wiped his good hand on his pants, waiting. "I'm looking for Ethan Parker." Mr. Vaughn's voice boomed deep and resonant, more of a command than a question. Claire quickly stepped out from the shadows, placing herself between her father and Ethan. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Her voice wavered, her hands clasped tightly together. "I told you I'd be home after I finish my work." Mr. Vaughn looked at his daughter, his gaze softening slightly but remaining stern. "You said you were on a business trip, but your assistant told me you canceled your flight 3 days ago. I never feel at ease when you go silent, Claire." The air in the workshop grew thick. Ethan was about to speak when a clattering sound came from under a table. Lily crawled out holding a shiny wrench, her face smudged with dirt, but beaming. "Daddy, I found the number 10 wrench. It rolled under there." She held up her prize and started to run over, but stopped short when she saw the stranger. Lily blinked at Mr. Vaughn, the tall man with the serious face. Instead of being scared, she tilted her head curiously. "Who are you, sir? Are you here to get your car fixed?" The child's arrival shattered the tense atmosphere. Mr. Vaughn looked down at Lily, then over at Ethan. He immediately recognized the protective look in Ethan's eyes. "Your daughter?" he asked, his voice losing some of its sharp edge. "Yes, my daughter Lily." Ethan replied, stepping forward to place a hand on her shoulder. Mr. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. He looked around the cramped workshop at the oil stains on the floor at Ethan's bandaged hand, and finally his gaze rested on Claire, wearing a simple shirt, her hair in a messy bun, a world away from her polished New York look. "You're a hard worker, I'll give you that," Mr. Vaughn said to Ethan, his tone even but direct. "But you're an intelligent man, Mr. Parker. You know Claire doesn't belong here. She wasn't born to breathe in the smell of motor oil." The words were polite, but cut like a knife. Claire started to protest, but Ethan spoke first. His voice was calm, without a trace of insecurity. "I know that, sir. I never thought I could keep her here. Claire belongs to the big sky out there. I've always known that." He paused, looking at Claire with a gentle but firm gaze. "But she has the right to choose where she stops to breathe, even if it's just for a moment." Mr. Vaughn was taken aback. He looked at the poor mechanic before him, a man who refused to bow to his power or money, who responded only with sincerity. "Sir, Lily's voice piped up, drawing everyone's attention down. She held out a scribbled drawing. I drew this for you. Daddy says when guests come, we have to be nice. Mr. Vaughn took the paper. It depicted a tall man in black clothes standing next to a car smiling, though he hadn't smiled once. Such pure innocence disarmed every class barrier. The corner of Mr. Vaughn's mouth twitched a nearly imperceptible smile. Thank you, he said softly, folding the paper carefully. He turned back to Claire. Have lunch with me. We need to talk. Sally's diner at the end of the street was quiet at lunchtime. Claire and her father sat across from each other in a corner booth. Mr. Vaughn ordered a black coffee, no sugar, a habit unchanged for years. I don't dislike him, he said, after a long silence, slowly turning a silver spoon in his hand. Not 15 years ago, and not now. I'm just a father, Claire, and I'm afraid of my daughter choosing the wrong path. I'm not choosing wrong, Dad. Claire replied, her voice soft but steady. She looked out the window at the yellow maple leaves falling. Ethan isn't a mistake. He's the piece I missed out on. Peace doesn't pay the bills, sweetheart. He sighed, the tired voice of a man who had fought in the corporate trenches his whole life. You're used to luxury. Can you handle counting every penny? Claire turned to look her father straight in the eye. I have all the money you ever wanted me to have, but in 15 years I have never slept as well as I have these past few nights in this town. You taught me how to make money, but Ethan taught me how to survive when my soul was empty. Mr. Vaughn fell silent, looking deep into his daughter's eyes. He no longer saw the stubborn college student, but the maturity of a woman who had tasted both glory and loneliness. He took out his wallet, placed some cash on the table, and stood up. I'll be staying at the town hotel tonight. I'm heading back tomorrow. Claire was surprised. You're staying? He adjusted his collar, speaking casually as he walked to the door. That garage, the awning needs fixing, and I hear the apple pie here is quite good. The little girl said so. Claire sat alone in the diner watching her father's back. A small smile formed on her lips. She understood. It was the only way a proud man like him could offer a compromise. Late in the afternoon, Claire returned to the garage. Ethan was struggling to put away tools with one hand. When he saw her, he stopped, his eyes full of worried questions. Your father, did he say anything? Claire walked over, took the wrench from his hand, and placed it in the toolbox. He said... She paused, deliberately watching his tense expression before breaking into a smile. He said you should fix that awning because he might stop by for some apple pie tomorrow. Ethan stared at her for a moment, then let out a long breath of relief, a radiant smile spreading across his face. In the corner of the workshop, Lily was humming to herself next to a new drawing she had taped to the wall. In this picture, beside the three familiar figures, there was a new one, a tall man in a black coat, and he was smiling. The sun set behind the mountains, casting its final golden rays into the workshop, turning everything from the oil stains to the healing wounds to gold. November swept into Riverside, bringing with it biting winds and the faded gold of maple leaves. The air began to smell of damp oak and hot cinnamon. At Riverside Garage, Mr. Richard Vaughn's black sedan had become a familiar sight, parked neatly beside Ethan's old pickup truck. He no longer arrived with the scrutinizing air of a chairman. He came bearing brown paper bags from Miller's Bakery, always filled with almond croissants or apple turnovers, Lily's favorites. Mr. Vaughn didn't talk much, and neither did Ethan. One Thursday afternoon, Ethan drove to the elementary school to pick up Lily. As he turned off the engine, he saw Mr. Vaughn already there, leaning against his luxury car, with his hands in his coat pockets, waiting patiently amidst the chattering parents. Ethan got out of his truck, adjusting the collar of his frayed shirt. He intended to keep his distance, but Lily burst out of the school gates. Grandpa, Daddy! She didn't choose who to run to first. She stood between the two men, her left hand grabbing Ethan's calloused one, her right hand taking Mr. Vaughn's, which wore a gold ring. I got an A in art today, Lily announced, her eyes shining. Mr. Vaughn bent down, examining the certificate as if it were the most important financial report he'd ever seen. Excellent. I think this calls for a celebration. Ethan stood beside them, watching. He didn't feel overshadowed. For the first time, he felt the weight on his shoulders being shared, even if just for the brief moment of waiting for his daughter after school. The two men looked at each other, a slight nod, serving as a greeting, and walked toward the cars together. A few days later, Claire had to return to New York for 2 days to handle an urgent contract, leaving the two men and the child to their own devices. In the garage, the air compressor hummed. Ethan was replacing the carburetor on a vintage Chevy. Mr. Vaughn sat on the wooden stool in the corner, the one Claire usually occupied, quietly observing. He no longer looked at the grease with distaste. He watched the way Ethan worked, meticulous, careful, and treating every part with respect. "You know, Mr. Vaughn said suddenly, his deep voice mingling with the sound of the light rain outside. "When Claire was Lily's age, I was busy building my empire. I hired the best nannies, sent her to the most expensive schools. But I never knew she liked to draw or hated carrots." Ethan stopped working, setting his screwdriver down. He didn't turn around, just wiped his hands on a rag, listening. "You don't have money, Ethan." He continued, not as a criticism, but as a bitter reflection. "But you have the one thing I lost a long time ago. Time." Ethan turned around, leaning against his workbench. He looked at the powerful man sitting there, with his well-hidden loneliness. "I didn't have another choice, sir," Ethan answered honestly. "Lily is all I have. If I don't spend time with her, I'll have nothing left." Mr. Vaughn nodded slowly. "You're doing a good job, better than I did." It was an admission. There was no document, no handshake, but in that workshop, thick with the smell of gasoline, a peace treaty had been signed between the two men. The following evening, Claire returned. She drove straight to Ethan's house without stopping at the hotel. It was already dark. A warm yellow light spilled from the living room window of the wooden house. Claire parked her car but didn't go in right away. She stood outside, peering through the uncurtained window. Inside, Lily was sprawled on the living room rug coloring. Ethan sat on the sofa, folding laundry, while reminding her to sit up straight. And in the armchair across from him, her father, Mr. Richard Vaughn, was wearing reading glasses and reading a fairy tale to Lily, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. 3 generations, 3 people with no blood relation, from completely different worlds sitting together under one roof, like a real family. Claire's heart clenched, a warm sensation rising in her eyes. She had spent her life chasing success, only to realize that happiness was right here, in the place she had once left behind. She realized she was no longer an outsider looking in at the picture. She was the final missing piece. Claire took a deep breath, blinked back a tear, and pushed the door open. "Mommy, Miss Claire is back," Lily shouted, an innocent slip of the tongue that made all 3 adults pause for a second, before pretending they hadn't heard. Ethan looked up, and his smile when he saw her was the softest light in the room. Perfect timing. The apple pie just came out of the oven. Mr. Vaughn closed the book, took off his glasses, and looked at his daughter with a kind gaze. "You're home, sweetheart." "Yes," Claire replied, hanging her coat on the rack. "I'm home." During their late dinner, Lily pulled a bright orange flyer from her backpack. "Everyone, this weekend is the fall festival in the town square. My teacher said there will be fireworks and a teddy bear contest." She looked at Ethan, then at Mr. Vaughn, and finally at Claire with wide, expectant eyes. "Can our whole family, can we all go together?" The atmosphere shifted for a beat. The festival was a public place. The 4 of them appearing together would be an unspoken declaration to the entire town. Ethan looked at Claire, waiting. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. Claire looked at her father. Mr. Vaughn calmly cut a piece of apple pie and ate it. "I hear they have a ring toss game there. I was pretty good at that in my youth." Claire laughed and turned to Lily, gently pinching her cheek. "All right, we'll go. Together." Ethan smiled, lowering his head to continue eating, but Claire saw his hand clenched tightly under the table, a gesture of suppressed emotion. Outside, the autumn wind blew harder, sweeping the golden leaves high into the air. Winter was coming, but inside this small wooden house, things were just beginning to warm up. The autumn night descended on Riverside, carrying the scent of cinnamon-spiced baked apples and the lively sound of country music. The town square, usually quiet, was now ablaze with thousands of warm yellow string lights draped over the ancient oak trees. Lily ran ahead, her mustard yellow velvet dress twirling with every step, a bright red balloon clutched in her hand. Ethan followed close behind, his daughter's small jacket draped over his arm. He wore a simple white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal his sinewy forearms, a rare, clean-cut look that made him seem slightly unfamiliar, but incredibly handsome. Bringing up the rear were Claire and Mr. Vaughn. Unspoken, they had naturally fallen into formation, like a real family on a weekend outing. "Over there, the cork gun game," Lily shouted, pulling Ethan by the hand. The group stopped at the game booth. Mr. Vaughn, a man who had only ever held pens to sign multi-million-dollar deals, now squinted at the pyramid of empty beer cans. He handed his expensive wool coat to Claire and rolled up his sleeves. "Let's see if the old man's still got it," he said, his voice surprisingly enthusiastic. Pop, pop, 2 misses. Lily giggled uncontrollably. Mr. Vaughn clicked his tongue, pretending to be annoyed as he reloaded. On the third shot, the top can clattered down. "He got it!" Lily jumped up and down, clapping. The old man let out a loud laugh, a genuine unguarded sound that erased his usual stern expression. Claire stood by, holding her father's coat, silently watching. She glanced at Ethan. He was leaning against a wooden post of the booth, smiling at her father and Lily. But in that smile, Claire detected a flicker of melancholy. He was there, but he seemed to feel like a mere spectator to their joy. As the group moved toward the ring toss area, the crowd grew thicker. A few locals recognized Claire and Mr. Vaughn. Curious glances started to shift in their direction. "Isn't that the Vaughns? Who's with them? Oh, the mechanic from the garage by the river." They looked strange together, like an odd pair. The whispers weren't loud, but they were loud enough for Ethan to hear. His posture stiffened. He unconsciously loosened his grip on Lily's hand and took a step back, creating a physical distance from the other three. Claire turned about to say something, but Ethan avoided her gaze. "You guys go on. I'm going to get Lily some water," he said hastily, then slipped into the crowd before she could stop him. Claire stood frozen amidst the joyful noise. She felt the palpable void he had left beside her. She handed her father's coat back to him and said curtly, "Dad, watch Lily for me." Then she turned and walked toward the riverbank. She found him on a bench hidden behind a row of willow trees where the festival lights were just blurry spots reflecting on the dark water. Ethan sat there, his hands clasped together, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. Claire said nothing. She walked over and sat down next to him. Not too close, but close enough for the warmth of her shoulder to reach him through his thin shirt. In a crowd like that, Ethan spoke first, his eyes still on the slow-moving water. "I realize just how different I am. Claire, this shirt doesn't make me one of them." Claire was silent for a moment. She didn't offer empty comfort or denials. She just did one simple thing. She reached out, took his tightly clasped, calloused hand, and laced her fingers through his. "I don't need you to be one of them," she said, her voice low and steady. "I need the man who knows how to fix my car when I'm stranded, who knows how to make ginger tea, and who knows how to stay when everyone else leaves." Ethan turned to look at her. In the soft glow of the lanterns floating down the river, he saw that her eyes were unwavering. A firework exploded in the sky, breaking the silence. Just then, the sound of frantic footsteps approached. "Daddy! Miss Claire!" Lily ran toward them out of breath, clutching a giant teddy bear nearly as big as she was. She shoved the bear into Ethan's arms. "I won the grand prize!" Lily yelled with delight. "The game master said this prize is for the person I love the most." Ethan took the bear, looking at his daughter in disbelief. You're giving it to me." "Yes." Lily grinned, then threw her arms around both her father and the bear. "You're my hero, and heroes are supposed to get presents." Ethan buried his face in his daughter's hair, his shoulders shaking slightly. Claire sat beside him, smiling through the tears that were now streaming down her cheeks. In the distance, Mr. Vaughn stood leaning against a willow tree, hands in his pockets, silently watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. As the festival wound down and the crowds thinned, Ethan carried a sleeping Lily on his back, the giant teddy bear in his other hand. Claire walked beside him occasionally, adjusting the blanket covering the little girl. Mr. Vaughn followed a few paces behind. The river wind picked up, and he turned up his collar, speaking casually to Claire when she glanced back. "You know, Claire, people don't choose where they're born, but tonight I saw that everyone has the right to choose how they treat others. He's a good man." Claire smiled and nodded softly. Her father's words were the final blessing she had been waiting for. Back at the house, Ethan laid Lily in her bed, carefully tucking her in. As he removed the teddy bear from her arms, a small piece of paper fell from its overalls. It was the prize ticket. He quietly picked it up, smoothed it out, and tucked it into his wallet. The next morning, when Claire opened her hotel room door, she found a small pine wood box on the doormat. Inside, there was no card, no grand declaration of love. There was only a simple hand-carved wooden bracelet, rustic and smooth to the touch. Engraved on the inside, in a tiny, slightly clumsy but careful script, were 5 words. "Thank you for coming back." Claire slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her for 15 years. Outside, the early winter sun began to spread its golden light over the roads, signaling that in their hearts a new season had truly begun. The late autumn wind gusted through the large bay door of Riverside Garage, sending a few dry leaves skittering across the cement floor. The air was much colder now, but inside the workshop, an invisible warmth seeped into every corner. Ethan was under the old Ford, only his work boots visible. The steady, sure sound of a wrench turning filled the air. Sitting on the tall wooden stool, a spot once reserved for stacks of old newspapers, was Claire. She wasn't wearing a blazer, but a cream-colored turtleneck sweater, a pen in her hand, as she meticulously reviewed the garage's financial ledgers. In the middle of the floor, Lily was sprawled out surrounded by a mess of crayons. And on the porch, Mr. Richard Vaughn sat in the old armchair which Ethan had reinforced the day before, calmly reading the financial news, occasionally peering inside over his reading glasses. Everything was slow, rhythmic, like a well-oiled machine. No one needed to say a word. Their presence filled the lonely spaces that had dominated this place for years. "Done!" Lily shouted, breaking the silence. She ran to Claire with her drawing. "Look, I drew our whole family." Claire put her pen down and took the paper. The drawing depicted a crooked but colorful garage. In front stood 4 stick figures, holding hands, a tall one, with a wrench one, with long hair, an old man with glasses, and a little girl in a pink dress. Above the roof, the little girl had carefully written Home. Claire laughed, her finger tracing the word, then leaned down and whispered, "It's beautiful, but you forgot one thing." "What?" Lily tilted her head. "A heart. A home needs a heart to be warm." "Oh," Lily exclaimed, grabbing a red crayon and drawing a giant heart that encompassed all 4 figures. Ethan slid out from under the car, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at the drawing, then at the 3 of them, and said softly, "Now it's complete." Late in the afternoon, Mr. Vaughn folded his newspaper and stood up, straightening his clothes. He walked around the workshop, his wrinkled hand brushing lightly over the tools on the wall before stopping to place a hand on Ethan's shoulder. There was no lecture, no formal handshake, just a pat on the shoulder, the acknowledgement of one man to another. He turned to Claire, his eyes kind. "I think you found the place you want to stop, daughter." Claire nodded, a soft, radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes, Dad. I'm not running anymore." Mr. Vaughn walked out the door, his long shadow stretching across the gravel. Lily's cheerful voice called after him, "Don't forget the apple turnovers next time, Grandpa." He turned back and let out a hearty laugh that echoed across the riverbank. When his car was out of sight, a sunset quiet settled over the garage. The evening light bathed everything in gold, turning the oil stains into shimmering patches. Claire hopped off the stool, grabbed a clean rag, and walked over to Ethan. "You know," she said, a teasing note in her voice as she wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek, "I'm starting to miss this smell of motor oil when I go back to the hotel." Ethan stood still, letting her clean his face, his gaze dropping to her cream-colored sweater. "Be careful, ma'am. Grease is a stubborn stain." Claire shrugged, continuing to wipe. "I'm used to dealing with stubborn things. You're a prime example." Ethan laughed, a deep, warm sound that rumbled in his chest. He took her by the wrist, stopping her. The space between them shrank, filled only by the sound of their breathing and heartbeats. Claire looked him straight in the eye, her voice suddenly serious, but her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Ethan, are you going to let me do your bookkeeping for free forever? The whole town is going to think I'm your assistant." Ethan paused for a second, then understood. He pulled her closer, their foreheads touching, his voice a sure and steady whisper. "I thought you liked being the assistant. That position, it's a lifetime contract, you know." "I'll have to think about it," Claire chuckled. "But for now, I'll accept tonight's dinner as a down payment." "Daddy, Miss Claire," Lily's voice called from the house's kitchen. Mr. Vaughn left the box of pastries. They're still warm. Ethan and Claire looked at each other and laughed. He let go of her hand, but slung his arm around her shoulder, guiding her toward the little wooden house. "All right," he said. "We'll discuss the lifetime contract after a piece of apple pie." The workshop door slowly swung shut. The silhouettes of 2 adults and 1 child were cast against the deep violet sky of twilight. Their laughter faded, blending with the river wind and the rustling of falling leaves. In Riverside, winter was on its way, but for them, a new spring had only just begun. Not everyone needs a lavish wedding to begin a life of happiness. Sometimes happiness is just finding the one person who makes you want to drive home a little earlier every day. Amidst the smell of motor oil, the sound of a child's laughter, and the scars that have finally healed, Ethan and Claire understood. A new season doesn't arrive by the calendar on the wall. It arrives the moment you stop being afraid and start daring to love again.